Political control was tight, but the more inventive and dexterous artists managed to create their art with few restraints by operating solely within the private spheres. Moreover, as globalization was advancing in China, many artists took advantage of the international media stage to compete for attention. And so extreme performances and gruesome installations, or as suggested by art critic Li Xianting's title for a provocative exhibition, Infatuation with Injury, 对伤害的迷恋, were fashionable, especially since some of the measures used, such as cannibalism, corpse display, and animal tortures, were forbidden in other developed and developing countries. And so, for a healthier image. Okay. So, today I want to shift to a different analytical angle to use social practice art to discuss several Chinese time-based artworks. My major contention is that social practice art, in its ethical and ideological foundations, is not foreign, but indigenous to the revolutionary ethos of China. And since art and politics have been deeply intertwined in China, the shifting political orientations in China's Communist Party, the CCP, often determine how artists choose to practice their art. In other words, political trends proactively incentivize and sometimes even overdetermine artistic fashions. I will share a recent personal example to illustrate this claim. In the winter of 2020, Susan Lacy and I, together with the Taiwanese artist Wu Mali, were invited by the Shanghai-based Public Art Journal for an interview piece about the emergence of new genre public art in China. In that collaborative piece, we discussed the shifting terminologies for this field and introduced social practice art as the label currently preferred by Susan Lacy and their peers. The fact that the highly visible Public Art Journal, which was founded in 2009 and has been receiving funding support from the provincial government, it's a 省级刊, devoted an entire issue to new genre public art in 2020, supports my observation that the political climate in China now encourages performative artworks in the expanded visual art field to be produced in service of the people. These productive conditions for socially engaged artworks is in line with Xi Jinping's regime and his efforts to continuously legitimize the CCP leadership by evoking the revolutionary Maoist legacy. Social practice art may be considered a cultural manifestation of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Okay, so if I may use one sentence to sum up this art form, I would say that social practice art is art with a purpose to serve others through the process of making art. If we want to make a slogan or a logo for a t-shirt for social practice art, I suggest making art for the greater good. And I have my t-shirt here. I forgot the poster. It's done by Rita Sterling. The problem with slogans, the slogan is, making art for social, for the greater good, right? But the problems with slogans is that they simplify things. It doesn't ask the implicit questions, such as who defines the greater good? Who are the people benefiting from the greater good? How is the greater good conceived and achieved? Social practice art is politically committed, but it doesn't guarantee that it will always make the world a better place for all. So I'm giving you some, the revolutionary posters. Here is you see Mao identified with the sun. As I mentioned earlier, social practice art as a concept is indigenous to and congenial with the Chinese revolutionary social, cultural, and political ethos. I will trace the lineage of social practice art in China to the Maoist ideology upheld during the Cultural Revolution and incrementally revived by China's current political regime. Art in service of the people was the official ideology during the Cultural Revolution. Yet the agent who defined the greater good for the people was an autocrat, Chairman Mao. Art for social change acquires a different connotation in this historical context. In his 1942 talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, Chairman Mao advocated for the practice of art to serve the people, which meant specifically the proletariat, including the 5 red categories: workers, farmers, merchants, students, and revolutionary soldiers. And here's a model human, Lei Feng. Yeah, and one more, the propaganda. As he divided the populace into desirable and undesirable categories, Mao also subordinated art under politics, making himself the center of art and politics. We can see this emphasis clearly in the propaganda posters I sampled here. There was only one model, one message on which artists were permitted to create their art, and that model was dictated by the communist leadership. Strict adherence was required at the risk of one's career or even one's very freedom. At this initial moment of social practice art in China, art and politics were intertwined. This condition remains a defining characteristic of social practice art in China. In other words, the Chinese government, specifically the Communist Party, solely determines the permissible artistic boundary for the greater good. As my examples, I will discuss two, actually I won't go into detail, but I will just discuss 2 historical exhibitions. And they share very similar circumstances, but they have very different outcomes. So the first one is the first exhibition of the stars, open air exhibition. You know, the 2, Wang Rui and Ma Desheng, that the 2 organizers, they got a permit, but they decided to, instead of waiting for a year, they will just exhibit right away. And so the exhibition was shut down because it's an open air exhibition. And then they decided on the National Day to walk from the Xidan Democracy Wall all the way, to talk about, and here is the word is 政治自由 and 艺术自由, political freedom and creative or artistic freedom together. Okay? And here is the media coverage, and this is Newsweek. Newsweek's coverage, and with Ma Desheng, that's at the center, it was in the crutches. Okay, so this mass demonstration resulted in the acceptance of the stars, and the exhibition was reopened in a gallery. Okay, so let's see. And so as a historical precedent for social practice art, the stars demonstration tells us 4 things. 1, the activism associated with social practice art existed at the onset of contemporary Chinese art. 2, the artists link artistic freedom with political freedom. 3, most of the artworks on display were stylistically traditional, and only a few critiqued the CCP's political power, such as Huang Geping's sculpture, these 2 sculptures, Idol and Silence. Thus, the exhibited artworks were largely non-controversial. It was the public nature of the exhibition's unsanctioned opening and its subsequent performative demonstration provoked by its closure that made the first star exhibitions historically significant. 4, the success of the demonstration and its tolerance by the CCP authorities reflected the more permissive political climate ensured by Deng Xiaoping's newly instituted open and reform policy. That was in December 1978. So this is 1979. Okay. In contrast, this other more famous exhibition, China Avant-Garde, okay, it's in 1989, February 1989. And it was closed because of the gunshot, the pistol event, right? And it was linked again with a massive demonstration. This is the Tiananmen event. It's Wu Yaobang as a more progressive leader by his death, and so started the mass demonstration And we all know that the Tiananmen Square massacre, right? So it's a very similar in circumstances, but different because of the political situation have changed. Okay, and so that, okay, because of the heightened political restriction and the conditional possibilities that all Chinese artists must negotiate in their own way. I'm talking about these two exhibitions that they exemplify the political restriction and the conditional possibilities. So both restrictions and possibilities that all Chinese artists must negotiate in their artistic practice. Because of the heightened political restrictions in the immediate years following the Tiananmen Square massacre, Chinese artists working in the non-static art mediums have roughly two options: turning inward, creating individualistic artworks in private and underground settings, or, when circumstances allowed, retaining an external public focus, but working within the limit of political permission. A relatively large number of artists who engage with extreme body works or with the painting trends of political pop and cynical realism chose the first option. But those who are interested in social practice art, owing to its inherent public and social focus, were compelled to choose the second option. Okay, and here is Suzanne Lacy again. In this slide, the Chinese social practice artists in the early 1990s were not unique in either their predicaments or their strategies. So Suzanne Lacy here, finding creative possibilities by working within the institutional limits, collaborating with systems of power to mainstream radical ideas, has been a highly productive method that Lacy employed in her social practice art career. Starting out as a minor, Lacy learned to work with power until she herself accrued enough power to determine the terms of her own art practice. And this is a more important part, and then I will skip. Okay. So in China, social practice art is particularly vulnerable to dictates of political agenda because of its affinity with civil society and public domain. As William Callahan put it bluntly, civil society seems to be a dead issue in China because of its formal aspects of mobilization and institutionalization are so tightly regulated by the party state. And so unquote. Artists of social practice are typically aspired to create what Bo Zheng characterizes as publicness, 公众性, a term inspired by the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas and his concept of the public sphere, defined as, quote, a realm of social life in which something approaching public opinion can be formed. Access is guaranteed to all citizens. Today, newspapers and magazines, radio and television are the media of the public sphere. So unquote. And Bo Zheng argues that Habermas shifted the connotation of the public from sites to human groupings, and thereby enabling the flexible analysis of the public on a range of scales. And Zheng places his own idea of publicness as a set of values that rest on four interconnected elements: the freedom of private citizens to express critical opinions, the attention to matters of general concern, the accessibility of the site, media, and discourse, and the commitment to reflective communicative practices based on reason and effect, rather than status, coercion, or profit. And so here I'm translating, basically Zheng's criteria to my earlier observation that about the necessity of the Chinese social practice artists to work within the limit of political power. In an overall hypersensitive environment of political surveillance, social practice artists in China could pursue creative autonomy and avoid potential political persecution by heeding how the Chinese government charts out matters of general concern. And by exercising their freedom as private citizens to express critical opinions within that politically sanctioned territory. Given China's political censorship and technological control, the site, media, and discourse of social practice art. Nevertheless, many artists do distinguish themselves from commercial interest groups by committing to art practice projects based on reason and effect rather than status, coercion, or profit. This general background of the government's political surveillance and the artist's creative negotiations constitutes the spheres of operation for today's social practice artists in China. In contrast, in the 1990s, when censorship in China created a ready market for its packaged dissident, more space opened in China in the new millennium to make the iconic dissident versus state framework less profitable and riskier, as evidenced by Ai Weiwei's 2011 disappearance. Nevertheless, as Callahan observed, more citizen intellectuals, quote, take advantage of China's new social and economic freedom to choose when to work with the state and when to work outside state institutions. I think Cai Guoqiang is a very good example of working on that. Popular resistance thus can emerge in a dissenter way in different social spaces, including the activities of everyday life. So at this point, we're wondering what are some of the politically feasible matters of general concern, right? One is ecology, and I will go in very fast. I think I probably exceed. Yeah, okay. Yeah, 5 more minutes? Okay, so we'll go over the slides, and if anything interests you, just remember and we'll come back to it. Okay, this Shipping's the forest project. I love this story. Yeah, and this is his drawing based on children's drawings. Yeah, and here's one of the earliest work that's about duration of social practice art, okay, and working with migrant workers. And this one is, I really want to bring out this one. It's the artist, this is showing Venice Biennale by Sun Yuan and Peng Yu. It's from a Du and Das UFO. And so this is actually I think, the origin of Cai Guoqiang, the Peasant Da Vinci project. Because Cai Guoqiang served as a curator for the Venice Biennale. Okay, and he got the idea of doing that. Okay, and here is a fairy tale of Ai Weiwei's another work is in 2007. And so just before the economic collapse, so this is cost a lot of money. And 1,001 chairs and 1,001 Chinese, as his fairy tale. And here is the dorm. Okay, and here, Cai Guoqiang's Peasant Da Vinci. And this installation, he actually call it fairy tale. So it's like echoing those Ai Weiwei and Sun Yuan told me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Meiling, Meiling, for that really amazing, enlightening talk, which I hope will lay really good groundwork for our conversation. We're speeding through things because we really hope that we can, in the spirit of social practice, have a conversation about the works that we're presenting. But thank you to Suzanne Lacey, who's appeared, celebrity as a person over there, for bringing us together, and especially thank you to Dr. Meiling Cheng, whose book, Beijing Xingwei, was a major inspiration for my own research and book. I was telling John Meiling that in 2008 I actually came to USC. I was just fresh out of my field of research for my PhD and did a presentation with her. She doesn't remember, but she was such a star that I remembered. I was so nervous, and I'm still a little bit nervous, so bear with me. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where Dr. Cheng left off and begin with Cai Guoqiang's project Peasant Da Vinci's, which I discuss in my book. About seeing contemporary urban culture and the fashioning of global Shanghai. As I point out, Cai's exhibition for the Rock Bund Art Museum in Shanghai, in which he exhibited the so-called peasant artists, who we might call in the United States outsider artists, coincided with the 2010 Shanghai World Expo, a large-scale worlding event designed to flex Shanghai's and China's soft power, both on a national and international stage. In conjunction with the exhibition, Tsai produced a large graffiti-like scrawl appearing at a construction site near the Rockbund Museum, which read, 农民让城市更美好, or Peasants Making a Better City, which riffed off of the official Expo slogan, Better City, Better Life, and called attention to the oft-overlooked migrant labor that fueled Shanghai and other Chinese megacities in the early 20th century. I've long found it hard to square Tsai Cheng's global stardust status. Here he is with his blockbuster exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in 2008, and his seemingly critical and humble stance vis-a-vis the Peasant da Vinci's and other projects. What I saw as Tsai Cheng's implicit critique of the Shanghai World Expo also clashed with his previous collaborations with the Chinese Communist Party on large-scale public art events, such as his fireworks display for the close of the 2008 Beijing Olympics and 2001 Shanghai APEC conference. We'll play a tiny bit of this, but brace yourselves, I think it's loud. Conducted along Shanghai's Huangpu River, straddling the Lujiazui skyline, China's chief symbol of rising economic might on the one side, and the Bund, the former heart of the British and US-controlled international settlement on the other, as a worlding project functioning much like the Beijing Olympics and Shanghai World Expo themselves. I critiqued popular celebrations of Tsai's projects as a meeting of East and West, or a coming together of Western land art or conceptual art with arguably orientalizing symbols of Chineseness, like dragons, the color red, and the fireworks themselves, a Chinese invention and the artist's signature medium. I have seen these as masking the artist's participation in the political spectacle of China's flexing its growing economic might. But now, amidst our current geopolitical environment characterized by increasing tensions between the US and China and rising nationalist movements in both countries, I find it important to also reconsider the artist's longer trajectory and particular struggles, which I think Meiling already pointed to really beautifully. Tsai Cheng grew to international prominence with his project Venice's Rent Collection Courtyard, which won an international prize when exhibited in the 1999 Venice Biennial. The project recreated a model socialist work of the Cultural Revolution, originally made by a team of sculptors from the Sichuan Academy of Fine Arts and installed in the courtyard of the seized mansion of a disgraced landlord, deemed a feudalist who exploited the peasants and worked his land, greedily collecting most of their harvest as his rent, leaving them hungry and impoverished. Tsai Cheng's reinterpretation of this piece, created in situ by artists from China, some of whom had worked on that original, was widely celebrated in the international art world. However, within mainland China, many critics decried the project and some threatened to sue Tsai for plagiarism. Interesting, given that the original, collectively produced work positioned itself as being by the people versus any single artist, as encouraged under Maoist cultural doctrine. In a paper delivered at the 2000 Shanghai Biennial, the Shanghai Biennial should not become a market stall in China for Western hegemony, Wang Nangming chastised Tsai Guo-chang for manufacturing what the art critic calls a Chinatown culture. An artistic Chinatown culture. An artistic tendency, especially on the part of overseas Chinese artists, to appropriate some simple motifs or symbols left behind by tradition, formulating these motifs into some essential markers of Chineseness. These art projects, Wang Nongming writes, are at best only on par with mass recreational activities in China's tourist industry, the culture of street stalls and ethnic performances made for tourists. I detect a nationalist tone in Wang Nongming's criticism, a tone that I increasingly seek to distance myself from. And I kind of feel like Kobina Mercer in his wonderful article on Robert Mapplethorpe's blackmail nudes, in which he realizes he doesn't want to align himself with Jesse Helms as wanting to censor this work. People outside mainland China often question Tsai's collaborations with the Chinese Communist Party. Tsai explains, people always want to ask me, why do you collaborate with the Chinese government on these projects? But everywhere in the world, artists work for their own governments. Tsai cites Damien Hirst's British flag-inspired stage for the London Olympics, but we also might think on a smaller scale of a local public art commission, Suzanne Lacey's project at the LAPD, or a collaboration with the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So Tsai continues, this sort of thing is only an issue if you are Chinese. Working for my country only becomes a problem because I was born in China. Watching the excruciating negotiations Tsai underwent and major compromises he had to make while working with CCP officials on the Beijing Olympics and Apex Cityscape fireworks, as depicted in the documentary Sky Ladder, The Art of Tsai Guo-chang, illuminates the pressures Chinese artists face. Film director Zhang Yimou, who served as the creative director for the Beijing Olympics and the APEC Cityscape Fireworks project, elaborates, quote, art needs to be free, but these projects have political requirements and one can do nothing about it. When you talk about creative work on these projects, those artists who grew up in free Western countries are not able to understand this. We really envy them, but there is nothing we can do about it. End quote. Sky Ladder concludes with Tsai's realization of a fireworks project in his hometown, a fleeting ladder-shaped sparkle of fireworks that the artist had long dreamed of making. Carried out on his own terms, surrounded by old friends, neighbors, and family that participated in its production and watching with joy, the relatively small, ephemeral act eclipses the official spectacle. I've too encountered some of the pressures Tsai and Zhang lament, albeit on a much smaller scale. I was recently commissioned by Art Review to write a piece about public art in Shanghai for a publication marking the opening of Shanghai Urban Space Art Season, a large-scale public art project along Shanghai's Huangpu riverfront organized by Art Pioneer Studio. My essay, Falling Lions, Rising Pandas, Falling Lions, Rising Pandas, A History of Public Art in Shanghai, discusses the history of public art along Shanghai's riverfront from the semi-colonial era, when the Bund was built up and controlled by British and American colonialists, through the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976, when Red Guards lambasted the Bund as the seat of imperialist plunder and forcibly removed the bronze lions, symbols of foreign colonialism and the import of capitalism that stood outside the Shanghai Hong Kong Banking Corporation, installed by the British, to present-day projects including Tsai's Peasant da Vinci's graffiti and contemporary public sculptures now on display. My editor and I were surprised and frustrated when the government-backed Art Pioneer Studio cut my references to the Maoist era, which is pretty generally, and to China's semi-colonial period, when the nation was occupied by foreign powers following the British-led Opium Wars from the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries, as the nation's so-called century of humiliation. The censors buried the critiques of power, no matter domestic or foreign. Some terms and references fell away, but I still hope, like Tsai, who had to give up his dream of incorporating environmentally friendly fireworks, video and narrative for his government-sponsored projects, that enough of the work remains. Famed Chinese artist and dissident Ai Weiwei, who Dr. Cheng also discussed, who helped design the Olympic Stadium before ultimately protesting the event, also knows these pressures well. Ai Weiwei was a boy when his father, the well-known modernist poet Ai Cheng, was exiled to remote posts, including in Xinjiang province, for years before and during the Cultural Revolution. Forbidden from writing poetry, officials forced Ai Cheng to clean toilets as re-education. Epitomizing the volatile political climate of 20th century China, Ai Cheng was pardoned following Mao's death and then invited back to Beijing, where he served as vice chairman of the Chinese Writers Association. For Ai Weiwei's Sunflower Seeds project, pictured here, originally exhibited at the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall in London, the artist oversaw the production of more than 100 million hand-painted porcelain sunflower seeds from the city of Jingdezhen. Ai Weiwei discusses the historical importance of sunflowers in China, which I think we also saw in Meiling's slides, as Mao's propaganda often pictured Mao as the sun, and all the people of China, his followers, as sunflowers. The movement of these handcrafted seeds from China into the Tate Turbine Hall aimed to give viewers a tactile experience with imported objects, possibly helping us to better fathom the labor that goes into almost all the items we touch daily, as China has become the so-called world's factory. And here I just want to take a pause, and again, we can come back to this if we have time, but to look at artist Cao Fei's distinct but connected strategy aimed at humanizing Chinese laborers, or even the non-humans involved in automated factories, as seen in projects like Who's Utopia, in which Cao collaborated with workers in a lighting factory to create playful performances that disrupt the monotony of repetitive labor, and Asia One, a fictional film and installation revolving around a kind of love story shot principally at a warehouse of JD.com, a massive multi-billion-dollar online retail company where robots handle most everything. So unfortunately, if you know the story, after Ai Weiwei's installation opened, museum officials grew concerned as the seeds emitted a harmful dust when stepped upon, and they were promptly swept aside and cordoned off into a side room where they could only be gazed upon from afar. For me, more interesting than Ai's sadly secluded seeds, which do raise interesting issues regarding differing international health standards, more interesting than this to me is the accompanying documentary, in which Ai describes his work with artisans in Jingdezhen, where he employed over 1,600 people for this project. Jingdezhen is a city in Jiangxi province, China, with a total population of nearly 1.7 million people, and has long been known as China's capital of porcelain production for over 1,000 years since the Han Dynasty. The artisanal town mostly languished during the Mao era, primarily producing Mao statues, and then was later mostly left out of the fast-paced, rapid urban development that swept China's eastern coastal cities. But in recent years, Jingdezhen has undergone a rejuvenation, aided perhaps by artists like Ai Weiwei, but also, probably more importantly, by emerging artists and designers who've increasingly moved or engaged long-term collaborations there. While Ai Weiwei's Sunflower Seeds documentary highlights old-fashioned, laborious techniques of porcelain production, it neglects to feature the city's vibrant present, as seen, for instance, in Jingdezhen's Imperial Kiln Factory Museum, recently rebuilt on the old site of the Imperial Kiln Factory, and Ceramic Art Avenue, encompassing ceramic museums, the ceramics fair and weekly market, contemporary art galleries, restaurants, ceramic malls, a grand theater and hotels, and the city's burgeoning experimental contemporary art and design. Another artist who frequently works in Jingdezhen is Lu Jianhua, who has a public sculpture included in the Shanghai Urban Space Art Season. Having grown up in Jingdezhen, Lu trained as a ceramicist in the Jingdezhen Pottery and Porcelain Sculpting Factory. Since the early 2000s, Lu has combined his training in porcelain production with a multimedia art practice that confronts social and environmental issues related to China's fast-paced development. His series, Regular Fragile, challenges globalization and China's rapid rise as a consumer society. Here, bluish-white ceramic objects replicate commodities such as hammers, milk cartons, handbags, high-heeled boots, baseball caps, soda bottles, and so on. These objects are assembled in large-scale installations that cover entire gallery floors, sometimes creeping up onto furnitures or walls or hanging suspended from ceilings. The uniformly colorless objects appear like the ghostly residue of commodity culture and the globalist capitalist production, capable of churning out more and more at ever-increasing rates. The title of his series, Regular Fragile, calls attention to the fragility of porcelain and to the illusory nature of the values that we so often assign to commodities. In 2007, Liu addressed the environmental harm that's caused by uneven global economic development in export cargo transit, a project consisting of a series of sculptures and paintings made out of garbage that had been imported into China from developed, so-called more developed nations, such as the US and Britain, which was encased in plexiglass and labeled art export. The project played on the re-importation of foreign trash as contemporary art by foreign collectors. And on the wall surrounding the encased detritus appeared statistics culled from both Chinese and foreign news articles on the Chinese importation of foreign trash. These alarming reports were juxtaposed against the legislation of the Basel Convention, negotiated and adopted by the UN Environment Program in 1989, which should have prohibited developed countries from exporting toxic waste to developing ones. Export cargo transit addresses the unequal relations between China and the developed Western nations of the mid-2000s, while offering a more general reflection on and critical response to globalization and resulting environmental hazards. His project also self-reflectively confronted the globalization of art and the artist's own conflicted position as a Chinese artist operating in a transnational contemporary art world. Keenly aware of how his career initially benefited from a predominantly Western art market's demand for the new, in this case contemporary Chinese art, Liu encouraged foreign collectors to purchase his works from export cargo transit while discouraging Chinese collectors. You may recognize Liu's photograph, likening Shanghai's fast-paced development to gamble as it appears on the cover of my book that I started this presentation with. Photographs by Liu also appear in Picturing Global China, an exhibition I curated at the University of Oregon, which with the participation of dozens of artists and photographers who generously shared their images of global China, illuminated the expanse of the term. I was fortunate to be able to include photographs and video art from artists who have since become colleagues here at USC, including John Alexander, who teaches in East Asian languages and cultures, and Patty Cheng, hi Patty, and David Kelly, brilliant artists and professors here in the Roski School of Art and Design. So I'm just going to conclude by giving a little sneak peek on future projects that I'm working on, as other works by Patty Cheng will appear in the forthcoming projects, so please keep an eye out for these. Queer Worlds, Queering Chinese American Art and Identity in Art and Film, a Visions and Voices screening, discussion, and filmmaking workshop that will take place this winter, January 27th and 28th, mark your calendars. And the new book and exhibition I'm working on that is Another Beautiful Country, Moving Images by Chinese American Artists, scheduled to open here at USC's Pacific Asia Museum in 2023. With these new projects, which center LGBTQ and women artists, I endeavor to join a broader movement to radically rethink art history through queer feminisms, showcased in my colleague, the inimitable Amelia Jones and Erin Silver's anthology Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories. In that anthology, the art historian Alpesh Patel writes of his contributions to Woman, the first mainland Chinese exhibition originally curated by Abby Chen for EMG Gallery in Shanghai to explore feminist and queer themes. Patel argues that to actively consider how the artworks in an exhibition might be historicized as part of one's curatorial practice may itself be a queer feminist strategy. Like Patel, I recognize that the artworks exploring feminism, gender, and sexuality in China, and by Chinese American artists, remain marginalized in art histories. So my current research seeks to produce art histories that avoid such marginalizations, while highlighting moving images tied to personal narratives, such as these works by the artist Charlene Liu, cinematic installations, reimagining her mom's Chinese restaurant, which is the only Chinese restaurant for many years in a small town in Wisconsin, and the silk screen, which integrates a photograph taken of my own grandmother's cheap house. Such hybrid works of art, film, and fashion offer badly needed means of sharing across and within cultures. And perhaps in their movement, and I'm thinking about this in relationship to Meiling's comments on static arts, perhaps in their movement, they craft a social sculpture, maybe with Chinese American characteristics. Thank you.